Third chapter. The religious mood. 45. The human soul and its limits, the range of man's inner experiences hitherto attained, the heights, depths and distances of these experiences, the entire history of the soul up to the present time, and its still unexhausted possibilities. This is the preordained hunting domain for a born psychologist and lover of a big hunt. But how often must he say despairingly to himself, a single individual, alas, only a single individual, and this great forest, this virgin forest. So he would like to have some hundreds of hunting assistants and fine-trained hounds that he could send into the history of the human soul to drive his game together. In vain. Again and again he experiences, profoundly and bitterly, how difficult it is to find assistants and dogs for all the things that directly excite his curiosity. The evil of sending scholars into new and dangerous hunting domains, where courage, sagacity and subtlety in every sense are required, is that they are no longer serviceable just when the big hunt, and also the great danger, commences. It is precisely then that they lose their keen eye and nose. In order, for instance, to divine and determine what sort of history the problem of knowledge and conscience has hitherto had in the souls of homines religiosi, a person would perhaps himself have to possess as profound, as bruised, as immense an experience as the intellectual conscience of Pascal, and then he would still require that widespread heaven of clear, wicked spirituality, which, from above, would be able to oversee, arrange and effectively formalize this mass of dangerous and painful experiences. But who could do me this service? And who would have time to wait for such servants? They evidently appear too rarely. They are so improbable at all times. Eventually one must do everything oneself in order to know something, which means that one has much to do. But a curiosity like mine is once for all the most agreeable of vices. Pardon me, I mean to say that the love of truth has its reward in heaven and already upon earth. 46. Faith, such as early Christianity desired, and not infrequently achieved, in the midst of a sceptical and southernly free-spirited world, which had centuries of struggle between philosophical schools behind it and in it, counting besides the education in tolerance which the Imperium Romanum gave. This faith is not that sincere, austere slave faith by which perhaps a Luther or a Cromwell or some other northern barbarian of the spirit remained attached to his God and Christianity. It is much rather the faith of Pascal, which resembles in a terrible manner a continuous suicide of reason, a tough, long-lived, worm-like reason, which is not to be slain at once and with a single blow. The Christian faith, from the beginning, is sacrifice, the sacrifice of all freedom, all pride, all self-confidence of spirit. It is at the same time subjection, self-derision and self-mutilation. There is cruelty and religious Phoenicianism in this faith, which is adapted to a tender, many-sided and very fastidious conscience. It takes for granted that the subjection of the spirit is indescribably painful, that all the past and all the habits of such a spirit resist the absurdicism in the form of which faith comes to it. Modern men, with their obtuseness as regards all Christian nomenclature, have no longer the sense for the terribly superlative conception which was implied to an antique taste by the paradox of the formula God on the cross. Hitherto there had never and nowhere been such boldness in inversion, nor anything at once so dreadful, questioning and questionable as this formula. It promised a transvaluation of all ancient values. It was the Orient, the profound Orient, It was the Oriental slave who thus took revenge on Rome and its noble, light-minded toleration, on the Roman Catholicism of non-faith, and it was always not the faith, but the freedom from the faith, the half-stoical and smiling indifference to the seriousness of the faith, which made the slaves indignant at their masters and revolt against them. Enlightenment causes revolt, for the slave desires the unconditioned. He understands nothing but the tyrannous, even in morals. He loves as he hates, without nuance, to the very depths, to the point of pain, to the point of sickness. His many hidden sufferings make him revolt against the noble taste which seems to deny suffering. The skepticism with regard to suffering, fundamentally only an attitude of aristocratic morality, was not the least of the causes, also, of the last great slave insurrection which began with the French Revolution. 47. Wherever the religious neurosis has appeared on the earth so far, we find it connected with three dangerous prescriptions as to regimen: solitude, fasting, and sexual abstinence. But without its being possible to determine with certainty which is cause and which is effect, or if any relation at all of cause and effect exists there. This latter doubt is justified by the fact that one of the most regular symptoms among savage as well as among civilized peoples is the most sudden and excessive sensuality, which then with equal suddenness transforms into penitential paroxysms, world renunciation and will renunciation, both symptoms perhaps explainable as disguised epilepsy. But nowhere is it more obligatory to put aside explanations. Around no other type has there grown such a mass of absurdity and superstition. No other type seems to have been more interesting to men, and even to philosophers. Perhaps it is time to become just a little indifferent here, to learn caution, or better still, to look away, to go away. Yet, in the background of the most recent philosophy, that of Schopenhauer, we find almost as the problem in itself, this terrible note of interrogation of the religious crisis and awakening. How is the negation of will possible? How is the saint possible? That seems to have been the very question with which Schopenhauer made a start and became a philosopher. And thus it was a genuine Schopenhauerian consequence that his most convinced adherent, perhaps also his last as far as Germany is concerned, namely Richard Wagner, should bring his own life work to an end just here, and should finally put that terrible and eternal type upon the stage as Kundry, type vécu, and as it loved and lived, at the very time that the mad doctors in almost all European countries had an opportunity to study the type close at hand. Wherever the religious neurosis, or as I call it, the religious mood, made its latest epidemical outbreak and display as the Salvation Army. If it be a question, however, as to what has been so extremely interesting to men of all sorts in all ages, and even to philosophers in the whole phenomenon of the saint, it is undoubtedly the appearance of the miraculous therein, namely, the immediate succession of opposites, of states of the soul regarded as morally antithetical. It was believed here to be self-evident that a bad man was all at once turned into a saint, a good man. The hitherto existing psychology was wrecked at this point. Is it not possible it may have happened principally because psychology had placed itself under the dominion of morals, because it believed in oppositions of moral values, and saw, read and interpreted these oppositions into the text and facts of the case? What? Miracle only an error of interpretation? A lack of philology? 48. It seems that the Latin races are far more deeply attached to their Catholicism than we Northerners are to Christianity generally, and that consequently unbelief in Catholic countries means something quite different from what it does among Protestants, namely a sort of revolt against the spirit of the race, while with us it is rather a return to the spirit, or non-spirit, of the race. We Northerners undoubtedly derive our origin from barbarous races. Even as regards our talents for religion, we have poor talents for it. One may make an exception in the case of the Celts, who have theretofore furnished also the best soil for Christian infection in the north. The Christian ideal blossomed forth in France as much as ever the pale sun of the north would allow it. How strangely pious for our taste are still these later French sceptics, whenever there is any Celtic blood in their origin. How Catholic, how un-German does Auguste Comte's sociology seem to us, with the Roman logic of its instincts. How Jesuitical that amiable and shrewd Cicerone of Port Royal, Sainte-Beuve, in spite of all his hostility to Jesuits. And even Ernest Renan, how inaccessible to us Northerners does the language of such a Renan appear, in whom every instant the merest touch of religious thrill throws his refined, voluptuous and comfortably couching soul off its balance. Let us repeat after him these fine sentences, and what wickedness and haughtiness is immediately aroused by way of answer in our probably less beautiful but harder souls, that is to say, in our more German souls. Disons donc hardiment que la religion est un produit de l'homme normal, que l'homme est le plus dans le vrai quand il est le plus religieux et le plus assuré d'une destinée infinie. C'est quand il est bon qu'il veut que la vertu corresponde à un odeur éternel, c'est quand il contemple les choses d'une manière désintéressée qu'il trouve l'amour révoltant et absurde. Comment ne pas supposer que c'est dans ces moments-là que l'homme voit le mieux? These sentences are so extremely antipodal to my ears and habits of thought that in my first impulse of rage on finding them, I wrote on the margin, La niaiserie religieuse par excellence, until in my later rage I even took a fancy to them, these sentences with their truth absolutely inverted. It is so nice and such a distinction to have one's own antipodes. 49. That which is so astonishing in the religious life of the ancient Greeks is the irrestrainable stream of gratitude which it pours forth. It is a very superior kind of man who takes such an attitude towards nature and life. Later on, when the populace got the upper hand in Greece, fear became rampant also in religion, and Christianity was preparing itself. 50. The passion for God. There are churlish, honest-hearted and importunate kinds of it, like that of Luther. The whole of Protestantism lacks the southern delicatezza. There is an oriental exaltation of the mind in it, like that of an undeservedly favoured or elevated slave, as in the case of St. Augustine, for instance, who lacks, in an offensive manner, all nobility in bearing and desires. There is a feminine tenderness and sensuality in it, which modestly and unconsciously longs for a unio mystica et physica, as in the case of Madame de Guyon. In many cases it appears, curiously enough, as the disguise of a girl's or youth's puberty, here and there even as the hysteria of an old maid, also as her last ambition. The Church has frequently canonized the woman in such a case. 51. The mightiest men have hitherto always bowed reverently before the saint, as the enigma of self-subjugation and utter voluntary privation. Why did they thus bow? They divined in him, and as it were behind the questionableness of his frail and wretched appearance, the superior force which wished to test itself by such a subjugation, the strength of will, in which they recognized their own strength and love of power, and knew how to honour it. They honoured something in themselves when they honoured the saint. In addition to this, the contemplation of the saint suggested to them a suspicion. Such an enormity of self-negation and anti-naturalness will not have been coveted for nothing, they have said inquiringly. There is perhaps a reason for it, some very great danger, about which the ascetic may wish to be more accurately informed through his secret interlocutors and visitors. In a word, the mighty ones of the world learned to have a new fear before him. They divined a new power, a strange, still unconquered enemy. It was the will to power which obliged them to halt before the saint. They had to question him. 52. In the Jewish Old Testament, the book of divine justice, there are men, things and sayings on such an immense scale that Greek and Indian literature has nothing to compare with it. One stands with fear and reverence before those stupendous remains of what man was formerly, and one has sad thoughts about old Asia and its little outpushed peninsula, Europe, which would like, by all means, to figure before Asia as the progress of mankind. To be sure, he who is himself only a slender, tame house animal, and knows only the wants of a house animal, like our cultured people of today, including the Christians of cultured Christianity, need neither be amazed nor even sad amid those ruins. The taste for the Old Testament is a touchstone with respect to great and small. Perhaps he will find that the New Testament, the Book of Grace, still appeals more to his heart. There is much of the odour of the genuine, tender, stupid beadsman and petty soul in it. To have bound up this New Testament, a kind of rococo of taste in every respect, along with the Old Testament into one book, as the Bible, as the book in itself, is perhaps the greatest audacity and sin against the spirit which literary Europe has upon its conscience. 53. Why atheism nowadays? The Father in God is thoroughly refuted, equally so the judge, the rewarder. Also his free will. He does not hear, and even if he did, he would not know how to help. The worst is that he seems incapable of communicating himself clearly. Is he uncertain? This is what I have made out, by questioning and listening at a variety of conversations, to be the cause of the decline of European theism. It appears to me that, though the religious instinct is in vigorous growth, it rejects the theistic satisfaction with profound distrust. 54. What does all modern philosophy mainly do? Since Descartes, and indeed more in defiance of him than on the basis of his procedure, an attentat has been made on the part of all philosophers on the old conception of the soul, under the guise of a criticism of the subject and predicate conception, that is to say, an attentat on the fundamental presupposition of Christian doctrine. Modern philosophy, as epistemological skepticism, is secretly or openly anti-Christian, although, for keener ears be it said, by no means anti-religious. Formerly, in effect, one believed in the soul as one believed in grammar and the grammatical subject. One said I is the condition, think is the predicate, and is conditioned. To think is an activity for which one must suppose a subject as cause. The attempt was then made, with marvellous tenacity and subtlety, to see if one could not get out of this net, to see if the opposite was not perhaps true. Think the condition, and I the conditioned. I, therefore, only a synthesis which has been made by thinking itself. Kant really wished to prove that, starting from the subject could not be proved, nor the object either. The possibility of an apparent existence of the subject, and therefore of the soul, may not always have been strange to him. The thought which once had an immense power on earth as the Vedanta philosophy. 55. There is a great ladder of religious cruelty with many rounds, but 3 of these are the most important. Once on a time, men sacrificed human beings to their God, and perhaps just those they loved the best. To this category belong the firstling sacrifices of all primitive religions, and also the sacrifice of the Emperor Tiberius in the Mithra grotto on the island of Capri, that most terrible of all Roman anachronisms. Then, during the moral epoch of mankind, they sacrificed to their god the strongest instincts they possessed, their nature. This festal joy shines in the cruel glances of ascetics and anti-natural fanatics. Finally, what still remained to be sacrificed? Was it not necessary in the end for man to sacrifice everything comforting, holy, healing, all hope, all faith in hidden harmonies, in future blessedness and justice? Was it not necessary to sacrifice God himself, and out of cruelty to themselves to worship stone, stupidity, gravity, fate, nothingness? To sacrifice God for nothingness, this paradoxical mystery of the ultimate cruelty has been reserved for the rising generation. We all know something thereof already. 56. Whoever, like myself, prompted by some enigmatical desire, has long endeavoured to go to the bottom of the question of pessimism and free it from the half-Christian, half-German narrowness and stupidity in which it has finally presented itself to this century, namely in the form of Schopenhauer's philosophy. Whoever, with an Asiatic and super-Asiatic eye, has actually looked inside and into the most world-renouncing of all possible modes of thought, beyond good and evil, and no longer like Buddha and Schopenhauer under the dominion and delusion of morality. Whoever has done this has perhaps just thereby, without really desiring it, opened his eyes to behold the opposite ideal, the ideal of the most world-approving, exuberant and vivacious man, who has not only learnt to compromise and arrange with that which was and is, but wishes to have it again as it was and is for all eternity, insatiably calling out da capo, not only to himself, but to the whole piece and play, and not only the play, but actually to him who requires the play, and makes it necessary, because he always requires himself anew, and makes himself necessary. What? And this would not be circulus vitiosus Deus? 57. The distance, and as it were the space around man, grows with the strength of his intellectual vision and insight. His world becomes profounder, new stars, new enigmas and notions are ever coming into view. Perhaps everything on which the intellectual eye has exercised its acuteness and profundity has just been an occasion for its exercise, something of a game, something for children and childish minds. Perhaps the most solemn conceptions that have caused the most fighting and suffering, the conceptions God and sin, will one day seem to us of no more importance than a child's plaything, or a child's pain seems to an old man. And perhaps another plaything and another pain will then be necessary once more for the old man, always childish enough, an eternal child. 58. Has it been observed to what extent outward idleness, or semi-idleness, is necessary to a real religious life, alike for its favourite microscopic labour of self-examination, and for its soft placidity called prayer, the state of perpetual readiness for the coming of God? I mean the idleness with a good conscience, the idleness of olden times and of blood, to which the aristocratic sentiment that work is dishonouring, that it vulgarizes body and soul, is not quite unfamiliar. And that consequently the modern, noisy, time-engrossing, conceited, foolishly proud laboriousness educates and prepares for unbelief more than anything else. Among these, for instance, who are at present living apart from religion in Germany, I find free thinkers of diversified species and origin, But above all, a majority of those in whom laboriousness from generation to generation has dissolved the religious instincts, so that they no longer know what purpose religions serve, and only note their existence in the world with a kind of dull astonishment. They feel themselves already occupied, these good people, be it by their business or by their pleasures, not to mention the fatherland and the newspapers and their family duties. It seems they have no time whatever left for religion, and above all, it is not obvious to them whether it is a question of a new business or a new pleasure, for it is impossible, they say to themselves, that people should go to church merely to spoil their tempers. They are by no means enemies of religious customs. Should certain circumstances, state affairs perhaps, require their participation in such customs, they do what is required, as so many things are done, with a patient and unassuming seriousness, and without much curiosity or discomfort. They live too much apart and outside to feel even the necessity for a for or against in such matters. Among those indifferent persons may be reckoned nowadays the majority of German Protestants of the middle classes, especially in the great laborious centres of trade and commerce. Also the majority of laborious scholars, and the entire university personnel, with the exception of the theologians, whose existence and possibility there always gives psychologists new and more subtle puzzles to solve. On the part of pious or merely church-going people, there is seldom any idea of how much goodwill, one might say arbitrary will, is now necessary for a German scholar to take the problem of religion seriously. His whole profession, and, as I have said, his whole workmanlike laboriousness, to which he is compelled by his modern conscience, inclines him to a lofty and almost charitable serenity as regards religion, with which is occasionally mingled a slight disdain for the uncleanliness of spirit which he takes for granted wherever anyone still professes to belong to the church. It is only with the help of history, not through his own personal experience, therefore, that the scholar succeeds in bringing himself to a respectful seriousness and to a certain timid deference in presence of religions. But even when his sentiments have reached the stage of gratitude towards them, he has not personally advanced one step nearer to that which still maintains itself as church or as piety, perhaps even the contrary. The practical indifference to religious matters, in the midst of which he has been born and brought up, usually sublimates itself in his case into circumspection and cleanliness, which shuns contact with religious men and things. And it may be just the depth of his tolerance and humanity which prompts him to avoid the delicate trouble which tolerance itself brings with it. Every age has its own divine type of naivety, for the discovery of which other ages may envy it, and how much naivety, adorable, childlike and boundlessly foolish naivety, is involved in this belief of the scholar in his superiority, in the good conscience of his tolerance, in the unsuspecting, simple certainty with which his instinct treats the religious man as a lower and less valuable type, beyond, before, and above which he himself has developed. He, the little arrogant dwarf and mob man, the sedulously alert, head and hand drudge of ideas, of modern ideas. 59. Whoever has seen deeply into the world has doubtless divined what wisdom there is in the fact that men are superficial. It is their preservative instinct which teaches them to be flighty, lightsome and false. Here and there one finds a passionate and exaggerated adoration of pure forms, in philosophers as well as in artists. It is not to be doubted that whoever has need of the cult of the superficial to that extent has at one time or another made an unlucky dive beneath it. Perhaps there is even an order of rank with respect to those burnt children, the born artists who find the enjoyment of life only in trying to falsify its image, as if taking wearisome revenge on it. One might guess to what degree life has disgusted them, by the extent to which they wish to see its image falsified, attenuated, ultrified and deified. One might reckon the homines religiosi among the artists as their highest rank. It is the profound, suspicious fear of an incurable pessimism which compels whole centuries to fasten their teeth into a religious interpretation of existence. The fear of the instinct which divines that truth might be attained too soon, before man has become strong enough, hard enough, artist enough. Piety, the life in God, regarded in this light, would appear as the most elaborate and ultimate product of the fear of truth, as artist adoration and artist intoxication in presence of the most logical of all falsifications, as the will to the inversion of truth, to untruth at any price. Perhaps there has hitherto been no more effective means of beautifying man than piety. By means of it, man can become so artful, so superficial, so iridescent and so good that his appearance no longer offends. 60. To love mankind for God's sake. This has so far been the noblest and remotest sentiment to which mankind has attained. That love to mankind, without any redeeming intention in the background, is only an additional folly and brutishness, that the inclination to this love has first to get its proportion, its delicacy, its gram of salt and sprinkling of ambergris from a higher inclination. Whoever first perceived and experienced this, however his tongue may have stammered as it attempted to express such a delicate matter, let him for all time be holy and respected, as the man who has so far flown highest and gone astray in the finest fashion. 61. The philosopher, as we free spirits understand him, as the man of the greatest responsibility, who has the conscience for the general development of mankind, will use religion for his disciplining and educating work, just as he will use the contemporary political and economic conditions. The selecting and disciplining influence, destructive as well as creative and fashioning, which can be exercised by means of religion, is manifold and varied, according to the sort of people placed under its spell and protection. For those who are strong and independent, destined and trained to command, in whom the judgment and skill of a ruling race is incorporated, religion is an additional means for overcoming resistance in the exercise of authority, as a bond which binds rulers and subjects in common, betraying and surrendering to the former the conscience of the latter, their innermost heart, which would fain escape obedience. And in the case of the unique natures of noble origin, if by virtue of superior spirituality they should incline to a more retired and contemplative life, reserving to themselves only the more refined forms of government, over chosen disciples or members of an order, religion itself may be used as a means for obtaining peace from the noise and trouble of managing grosser affairs, and for securing immunity from the unavoidable filth of all political agitation. The Brahmins, for instance, understood this fact. With the help of a religious organisation, they secured to themselves the power of nominating kings for the people, while their sentiments prompted them to keep apart and outside, as men with a higher and superregal mission. At the same time, religion gives inducement and opportunity to some of the subjects to qualify themselves for future ruling and commanding the slowly ascending ranks and classes, in which, through fortunate marriage customs, volitional power and delight in self-control are on the increase. To them, religion offers sufficient incentives and temptations to aspire to higher intellectuality, and to experience the sentiments of authoritative self-control, of silence and of solitude. Asceticism and Puritanism are almost indispensable means of educating and ennobling a race which seeks to rise above its hereditary baseness and work itself upwards to future supremacy. And finally, to ordinary men, To the majority of the people, who exist for service and general utility, and are only so far entitled to exist, religion gives invaluable contentedness with their lot and condition, peace of heart, ennoblement of obedience, additional social happiness and sympathy, with something of transfiguration and embellishment, something of justification of all the commonplaceness, all the meanness, all the semi-animal poverty of their souls. Religion, together with the religious significance of life, sheds sunshine over such perpetually harassed men, and makes even their own aspect endurable to them. It operates upon them as the Epicurean philosophy usually operates upon sufferers of a higher order, in a refreshing and refining manner, almost turning suffering to account, and in the end even hallowing and vindicating it. There is perhaps nothing so admirable in Christianity and Buddhism as their art of teaching even the lowest to elevate themselves by piety to a seemingly higher order of things, and thereby to retain their satisfaction with the actual world in which they find it difficult enough to live, this very difficulty being necessary. 62. To be sure, to make also the bad counter-reckoning against such religions, and to bring to light their secret dangers, the cost is always excessive and terrible when religions do not operate as an educational and disciplinary medium in the hands of the philosopher, but rule voluntarily and paramountly, when they wish to be the final end and not a means along with other means. Among men, as among all other animals, there is a surplus of defective, diseased, degenerating, infirm, and necessarily suffering individuals. The successful cases, among men also, are always the exception, and in view of the fact that man is the animal not yet properly adapted to his environment, the rare exception. But worse still, the higher the type a man represents, the greater is the improbability that he will succeed. The accidental, the law of irrationality in the general constitution of mankind, manifests itself most terribly in its destructive effect on the higher orders of men, the conditions of whose lives are delicate, diverse, and difficult to determine. What, then, is the attitude of the two greatest religions above mentioned to the surplus of failures in life? They endeavour to preserve and keep alive whatever can be preserved. In fact, as the religions for sufferers, they take the part of these upon principle. They are always in favour of those who suffer from life as from a disease, and they would fain treat every other experience of life as false and impossible. However highly we may esteem this indulgent and preservative care, inasmuch as in applying to others it has applied and applies also to the highest and usually the most suffering type of man, the hitherto paramount religions, to give a general appreciation of them, are among the principal causes which have kept the type of man upon a lower level. They have preserved too much that which should have perished. One has to thank them for invaluable services, and who is sufficiently rich in gratitude not to feel poor at the contemplation of all that the spiritual men of Christianity have done for Europe hitherto? But when they had given comfort to the sufferers, courage to the oppressed and despairing, a staff and support to the helpless, and when they had allured from society into convents and spiritual penitentiaries the broken-hearted and distracted, what else had they to do in order to work systematically in that fashion, and with a good conscience, for the preservation of all the sick and suffering, which means, in deed and in truth, to work for the deterioration of the European race? To reverse all estimates of value, that is what they had to do. And to shatter the strong, to spoil great hopes, to cast suspicion on the delight in beauty, to break down everything autonomous, manly, conquering and imperious, all instincts which are natural to the highest and most successful type of man, into uncertainty, distress of conscience and self-destruction. Forsooth, to invert all love of the earthly and of supremacy over the earth into hatred of the earth and earthly things, that is the task the Church imposed on itself, and was obliged to impose, until, according to its standard of value, unworldliness, unsensuousness, and higher man fused into one sentiment. If one could observe the strangely painful, equally coarse and refined comedy of European Christianity with the derisive and impartial eye of an Epicurean god, I should think one would never cease marvelling and laughing. Does it not actually seem that some single will has ruled over Europe for 18 centuries in order to make a sublime abortion of man? He, however, who, with opposite requirements, no longer Epicurean, and with some divine hammer in his hand, could approach this almost voluntary degeneration and stunting of mankind, as exemplified in the European Christian, Pascal for instance, would he not have to cry aloud with rage, pity and horror, "O you bunglers, presumptuous, pitiful bunglers, what have you done? Was that a work for your hands? How you have hacked and botched my finest stone! What have you presumed to do?" I should say that Christianity has hitherto been the most portentous of presumptions. Men, not great enough nor hard enough to be entitled as artists to take part in fashioning man, men not sufficiently strong and far-sighted to allow, with sublime self-constraint, the obvious law of the thousandfold failures and perishings to prevail, not sufficiently noble to see the radically different grades of rank and intervals of rank that separate man from man. Such men, with their equality before God, have hitherto swayed the destiny of Europe, until at last a dwarfed, almost ludicrous species has been produced, a gregarious animal, something obliging, sickly, mediocre, the European of the present day. End of chapter 3. Fourth chapter. Apothegms and Interludes. 63. He who is a thorough teacher takes things seriously, and even himself, only in relation to his pupils. 64. Knowledge for its own sake, that is the last snare laid by morality. We are thereby completely entangled in morals once more. 65. The charm of knowledge would be small, were it not so much shame has to be overcome on the way to it. 65a. We are most dishonourable towards our God. He is not permitted to sin. 66. The tendency of a person to allow himself to be degraded, robbed, deceived and exploited might be the diffidence of a god among men. 67. Love to one only is a barbarity, for it is exercised at the expense of all others. Love to God also. 68. I did that, says my memory. I could not have done that, says my pride, and remains inexorable. Eventually, the memory yields. 69. One has regarded life carelessly if one has failed to see the hand that kills with leniency. 70. If a man has character, he has also his typical experience, which always recurs. 71. The sage as astronomer. So long as thou feelest the stars as an above thee, thou lackest the eye of the discerning one. 72. It is not the strength, but the duration of great sentiments that makes great men. 73. He who attains his ideal precisely thereby surpasses it. 73a. Many a peacock hides his tail from every eye and calls it his pride. 74. A man of genius is unbearable unless he possess at least two things besides: gratitude and purity. 75. The degree and nature of a man's sensuality extends to the highest altitudes of his spirit. 76. Under peaceful conditions, the militant man attacks himself. 77. With his principles, a man seeks either to dominate, or justify, or honour, or reproach, or conceal his habits. Two men with the same principles probably seek fundamentally different ends therewith. 78. He who despises himself nevertheless esteems himself thereby as a despiser. 79. A soul which knows that it is loved but does not itself love betrays its sediment, its dregs come up. 80. A thing that is explained ceases to concern us. What did the God mean who gave the advice, "Know thyself"? Did it perhaps imply, cease to be concerned about thyself, become objective? And Socrates? And the scientific man? 81. It is terrible to die of thirst at sea. Is it necessary that you should so salt your truth that it will no longer quench thirst? 82. Sympathy for all would be harshness and tyranny for thee, my good neighbour. 83. Instinct. When the house is on fire, one forgets even the dinner. Yes, but one recovers it from among the ashes. 84. Woman learns how to hate in proportion as she forgets how to charm. 85. The same emotions are in man and woman, but in different tempo. On that account, man and woman never cease to misunderstand each other. 86. In the background of all their personal vanity, women themselves have still their impersonal scorn for woman. 87. Fettered heart, free spirit. When one firmly fetters one's heart and keeps it prisoner, one can allow one's spirit many liberties. I said this once before, but people do not believe it when I say so, unless they know it already. 88. One begins to distrust very clever persons when they become embarrassed. 89. Dreadful experiences raise the question whether he who experiences them is not something dreadful also. 90. Heavy, melancholy men turn lighter and come temporarily to their surface precisely by that which makes others heavy, by hatred and love. 91. So cold, so icy that one burns one's finger at the touch of him. Every hand that lays hold of him shrinks back, and for that very reason many think him red hot. 92. Who has not, at one time or another, sacrificed himself for the sake of his good name? 93. In affability there is no hatred of men, but precisely on that account a great deal too much contempt of men. 94. The maturity of man. That means to have reacquired the seriousness that one had as a child at play. 95. To be ashamed of one's immorality is a step on the ladder at the end of which one is ashamed also of one's morality. 96. One should part from life as Ulysses parted from Nausicaa, blessing it rather than in love with it. 97. What? A great man? I always see merely the play actor of his own ideal. 98. When one trains one's conscience, it kisses one while it bites. 99. The disappointed one speaks. I listened for the echo and I heard only praise. 100. We all feign to ourselves that we are simpler than we are. We thus relax ourselves away from our fellows. 101. A discerning one might easily regard himself at present as the animalization of God. 102. Discovering reciprocal love should really disenchant the lover with regard to the beloved. What? She is modest enough to love even you? Or stupid enough? Or... 103. The danger in happiness. Everything now turns out best for me. I now love every fate. Who would like to be my fate? 104. Not their love of humanity, but the impotence of their love prevents the Christians of today burning us. 105. The pia fraus is still more repugnant to the taste, the piety, of the free spirit, the pious man of knowledge, than the impia fraus. Hence the profound lack of judgment, in comparison with the Church, characteristic of the type free spirit, as its non-freedom. 106. By means of music, the very passions enjoy themselves. 107. A sign of strong character, when once the resolution has been taken, to shut the ear even to the best counter-arguments. Occasionally, therefore, a will to stupidity. 108. There is no such thing as moral phenomena, but only a moral interpretation of phenomena. 109. The criminal is often enough not equal to his deed. He extenuates and maligns it. 110. The advocates of a criminal are seldom artists enough to turn the beautiful terribleness of the deed to the advantage of the doer. 111. Our vanity is most difficult to wound just when our pride has been wounded. 112. To him who feels himself preordained to contemplation and not to belief, all believers are too noisy and obtrusive. He guards against them. 113. You want to prepossess him in your favour? Then you must be embarrassed before him. 114. The immense expectation with regard to sexual love and the coyness in this expectation spoils all the perspectives of women at the outset. 115. Where there is neither love nor hatred in the game, women's play is mediocre. 116. The great epochs of our life are at the points when we gain courage to rebaptize our badness as the best in us. 117. The will to overcome an emotion is ultimately only the will of another, or of several other emotions. 118. There is an innocence of admiration. It is possessed by him to whom it has not yet occurred that he himself may be admired some day. 119. Our loathing of dirt may be so great as to prevent our cleaning ourselves, justifying ourselves. 120. Sensuality often forces the growth of love too much, so that its root remains weak and is easily torn up. 121. It is a curious thing that God learned Greek when he wished to turn author, and that he did not learn it better. 122. To rejoice on account of praise is, in many cases, merely politeness of heart, and the very opposite of vanity of spirit. 123. Even concubinage has been corrupted by marriage. 124. He who exults at the stake does not triumph over pain, but because of the fact that he does not feel pain where he expected it. A parable. 125. When we have to change an opinion about anyone, we charge heavily to his account the inconvenience he thereby causes us. 126. A nation is a detour of nature to arrive at 6 or 7 great men. Yes, and then to get round them. 127. In the eyes of all true women, science is hostile to the sense of shame. They feel as if one wished to peep under their skin with it, or worse still, under their dress and finery. 128. The more abstract the truth you wish to teach, the more must you allure the senses to it. 129. The devil has the most extensive perspectives for God. On that account he keeps so far away from him. The devil, in effect, is the oldest friend of knowledge. 130. What a person is begins to betray itself when his talent decreases, when he ceases to show what he can do. Talent is also an adornment is also a concealment. 131. The sexes deceive themselves about each other. The reason is that in reality they honour and love only themselves, or their own ideal, to express it more agreeably. Thus, man wishes woman to be peaceable, but in fact woman is essentially unpeaceable, like the cat, however well she may have assumed the peaceable demeanour. 132. One is punished best for one's virtues. 133. He who cannot find the way to his ideal lives more frivolously and shamelessly than the man without an ideal. 134. From the senses originate all trustworthiness, all good conscience, all evidence of truth. 135. Pharisaism is not a deterioration of the good man. A considerable part of it is rather an essential condition of being good. 136. The one seeks an accoucheur for his thoughts, the other seeks someone whom he can assist. A good conversation thus originates. 137. In intercourse with scholars and artists, one readily makes mistakes of opposite kinds. In a remarkable scholar, one not infrequently finds a mediocre man, and often, even in a mediocre artist, one finds a very remarkable man. 138. We do the same when awake as when dreaming. We only invent and imagine him with whom we have intercourse, and forget it immediately. 139. In revenge and in love, woman is more barbarous than man. 140. Advice as a riddle. If the band is not to break, bite it first, secure to make. 141. The belly is the reason why man does not so readily take himself for a god. 142. the chastest utterance I ever heard. Dans le véritable amour, c'est l'âme qui enveloppe le corps. 143. Our vanity would like what we do best to pass precisely for what is most difficult to us, concerning the origin of many systems of morals. 144. When a woman has scholarly inclinations, there is generally something wrong with her sexual nature. Barrenness itself conduces to a certain virility of taste. Man, indeed, if I may say so, is the barren animal. 145. Comparing man and woman generally, one may say that woman would not have the genius for adornment if she had not the instinct for the secondary role. 146. He who fights with monsters should be careful, lest he thereby become a monster. And if thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee. 147. From old Florentine novels, moreover from life, buona femmina e mala femmina vol bastone. Sacchetti, November 86. 148. To seduce their neighbour to a favourable opinion, and afterwards to believe implicitly in this opinion of their neighbour, who can do this conjuring trick so well as women? 149. That which an age considers evil is usually an unseasonable echo of what was formerly considered good, the atavism of an old ideal. 150. Around the hero everything becomes a tragedy. Around the demigod everything becomes a satyr play. And around God everything becomes what? Perhaps a world? 151. It is not enough to possess a talent. One must also have your permission to possess it, eh, my friends? 152. Where there is the tree of knowledge, there is always paradise. So say the most ancient and the most modern serpents. 153. What is done out of love always takes place beyond good and evil. 154. Objection, evasion, joyous distrust, and love of irony are signs of health. Everything absolute belongs to pathology. 155. The sense of the tragic increases and declines with sensuousness. 156. Insanity in individuals is something rare, but in groups, parties, nations and epochs it is the rule. 157. The thought of suicide is a great consolation. By means of it one gets successfully through many a bad night. 158. Not only our reason, but also our conscience truckles to our strongest impulse, the tyrant in us. 159. One must repay good and ill, but why just to the person who did us good or ill? 160. One no longer loves one's knowledge sufficiently after one has communicated it. 161. Poets act shamelessly towards their experiences. They exploit them. 162. Our fellow creature is not our neighbour, but our neighbour's neighbour. So thinks every nation. 163. Love brings to light the noble and hidden qualities of a lover, his rare and exceptional traits. It is thus liable to be deceptive as to his normal character. 164. Jesus said to his Jews, The law was for servants. Love God as I love him, as his son. What have we sons of God to do with morals? 165. In sight of every party. A shepherd has always need of a bellwether, or he has himself to be a wether occasionally. 166. One may indeed lie with the mouth, but with the accompanying grimace one nevertheless tells the truth. 167. To vigorous men, intimacy is a matter of shame, and something precious. 168. Christianity gave Eros poison to drink. He did not die of it, certainly, but degenerated to vice. 169. To talk much about oneself may also be a means of concealing oneself. 170. In praise there is more obtrusiveness than in blame. 171. Pity has an almost ludicrous effect on a man of knowledge, like tender hands on a cyclops. 172. One occasionally embraces someone or other out of love to mankind, because one cannot embrace all, but this is what one must never confess to the individual. 173. One does not hate as long as one disesteems, but only when one esteems equal or superior. 174. Ye utilitarians, ye too love the utile only as a vehicle for your inclinations. Ye too really find the noise of its wheels insupportable. 175. One loves ultimately one's desires, not the thing desired. 176. The vanity of others is only counter to our taste when it is counter to our vanity. 177. With regard to what truthfulness is, perhaps nobody has ever been sufficiently truthful. 178. One does not believe in the follies of clever men. What a forfeiture of the rights of man! 179. The consequences of our actions seize us by the forelock, very indifferent to the fact that we have meanwhile reformed. 180. There is an innocence in lying which is the sign of good faith in a cause. 181. It is inhuman to bless when one is being cursed. 182. The familiarity of superiors embitters one because it may not be returned. 183. I am affected not because you have deceived me, but because I can no longer believe in you. 184. There is a haughtiness of kindness which has the appearance of wickedness. 185. I dislike him. Why? I am not a match for him. Did anyone ever answer so? End of chapter 4. Fifth chapter, The Natural History of Morals. 186. The moral sentiment in Europe at present is perhaps as subtle, belated, diverse, sensitive and refined as the science of morals belonging thereto is recent, initial, awkward and coarse-fingered, an interesting contrast which sometimes becomes incarnate and obvious in the very person of a moralist. Indeed, the expression science of morals is, in respect to what is designated thereby, far too presumptuous and counter to good taste, which is always a foretaste of more modest expressions. one ought to avow with the utmost fairness what is still necessary here for a long time, what is alone proper for the present, namely the collection of material, the comprehensive survey and classification of an immense domain of delicate sentiments of worth and distinctions of worth, which live, grow, propagate and perish, and perhaps attempts to give a clear idea of the recurring and more common forms of these living crystallizations as preparation for a theory of types of morality. To be sure, people have not hitherto been so modest. All the philosophers, with a pedantic and ridiculous seriousness, demanded of themselves something very much higher, more pretentious and ceremonious, when they concerned themselves with morality as a science. They wanted to give a basis to morality, and every philosopher hitherto has believed that he has given it a basis. Morality itself, however, has been regarded as something given. How far from their awkward pride was the seemingly insignificant problem, left in dust and decay, of a description of forms of morality, notwithstanding that the finest hands and senses could hardly be fine enough for it. It was precisely owing to moral philosophers knowing the moral facts imperfectly, in an arbitrary epitome or an accidental abridgment, perhaps as the morality of their environment, their position, their church, their zeitgeist, their climate and zone. It was precisely because they were badly instructed with regard to nations, eras and past ages, and were by no means eager to know about these matters, that they did not even come in sight of the real problems of morals, problems which only disclose themselves by a comparison of many kinds of morality. In every science of morals hitherto, strange as it may sound, the problem of morality itself has been omitted. There has been no suspicion that there was anything problematic there. That which philosophers called giving a basis to morality, and endeavoured to realise, has, when seen in a right light, proved merely a learned form of good faith in prevailing morality, a new means of its expression, consequently just a matter of fact within the sphere of a definite morality, yea, in its ultimate motive, a sort of denial that it is lawful for this morality to be called in question, and in any case the reverse of the testing, analysing, doubting and vivisecting of this very faith. Here, for instance, with what innocence, almost worthy of honour, Schopenhauer represents his own task, and draw your conclusions concerning the scientificness of a science whose latest master still talks in the strain of children and old wives. The principle, he says, page 136 of the Grundproblem der Ethik, the axiom about the purport of which all moralists are practically agreed, neminem laede immo omnes quantile potes juva, is really the proposition which all moral teachers strive to establish, the real basis of ethics which has been sought, like the philosopher's stone, for centuries. The difficulty of establishing the proposition referred to may indeed be great. It is well known that Schopenhauer also was unsuccessful in his efforts, and whoever has thoroughly realised how absurdly false and sentimental this proposition is, in a world whose essence is will to power, may be reminded that Schopenhauer, although a pessimist, actually played the flute daily after dinner. One may read about the matter in his biography. A question, by the way, a pessimist, a repudiator of God and the world, who makes a halt at morality, who assents to morality, and plays the flute to laede neminem morals. What? Is that really a pessimist? 187. Apart from the value of such assertions as, there is a categorical imperative in us, one can always ask, what does such an assertion indicate about him who makes it? There are systems of morals which are meant to justify their author in the eyes of other people. Other systems of morals are meant to tranquilize him and make him self-satisfied. With other systems he wants to crucify and humble himself. With others he wishes to take revenge. With others to conceal himself. With others to glorify himself and give superiority and distinction. This system of morals helps its author to forget. That system makes him, or something of him, forgotten. Many a moralist would like to exercise power and creative arbitrariness over mankind. Many another, perhaps Kant especially, gives us to understand by his morals that what is estimable in me is that I know how to obey, and with you it shall not be otherwise than with me. In short, systems of morals are only a sign language of the emotions. 188. In contrast to laissez-aller, every system of morals is a sort of tyranny against nature, and also against reason. That is, however, no objection, unless one should again decree by some system of morals that all kinds of tyranny and unreasonableness are unlawful. What is essential and invaluable in every system of morals is that it is a long constraint. In order to understand Stoicism, or Port Royal, or Puritanism, one should remember the constraint under which every language has attained to strength and freedom, the metrical constraint, the tyranny of rhyme and rhythm. How much trouble have the poets and orators of every nation given themselves, not excepting some of the prose writers of today, in whose ear dwells an inexorable conscientiousness, for the sake of a folly, as utilitarian bunglers say, and thereby deem themselves wise, from submission to arbitrary laws, as the anarchists say, and thereby fancy themselves free, even free-spirited. The singular fact remains, however, that everything of the nature of freedom, elegance, boldness, dance, and masterly certainty, which exists or has existed, whether it be in thought itself, or in administration, or in speaking and persuading, in art just as in conduct, has only developed by means of the tyranny of such arbitrary law. And, in all seriousness, it is not at all improbable that precisely this is nature and natural, and not laissez-aller. Every artist knows how different from the state of letting himself go is his most natural condition, the free arranging, locating, disposing and constructing in the moments of inspiration, and how strictly and delicately he then obeys 1,000 laws, which, by their very rigidness and precision, defy all formulation by means of ideas. Even the most stable idea has, in comparison therewith, something floating, manifold and ambiguous in it. The essential thing in heaven and in earth is apparently, to repeat it once more, that there should be long obedience in the same direction. Thereby results, and has always resulted in the long run, something which has made life worth living. For instance, virtue, art, music, dancing, reason, spirituality, anything whatever that is transfiguring, refined, foolish or divine. The long bondage of the spirit, the distrustful constraint in the communicability of ideas, the discipline which the thinker imposed on himself to think in accordance with the rules of a church or a court, or conformable to Aristotelian premises, the persistent spiritual will to interpret everything that happened according to a Christian scheme, and in every occurrence to rediscover and justify the Christian God. All this violence, arbitrariness, severity, dreadfulness and unreasonableness has proved itself the disciplinary means whereby the European spirit has attained its strength, its remorseless curiosity and subtle mobility. Granted also that much irrecoverable strength and spirit had to be stifled, suffocated and spoilt in the process. For here, as everywhere, nature shows herself as she is, in all her extravagant and indifferent magnificence, which is shocking but nevertheless noble. That for centuries European thinkers only thought in order to prove something. Nowadays, on the contrary, we are suspicious of every thinker who wishes to prove something. That it was always settled beforehand what was to be the result of their strictest thinking, as it was perhaps in the Asiatic astrology of former times, or as it is still at the present day in the innocent, Christian moral explanation of immediate personal events, for the glory of God, or for the good of the soul. This tyranny, this arbitrariness, this severe and magnificent stupidity has educated the spirit. Slavery, both in the coarser and the finer sense, is apparently an indisputable means even of spiritual education and discipline. One may look at every system of morals in this light. It is nature therein which teaches to hate the laisser-aller, the too great freedom, and implants the need for limited horizons, for immediate duties. It teaches the narrowing of perspectives, and thus, in a certain sense, that stupidity is a condition of life and development. Thou must obey someone, and for a long time, otherwise thou wilt come to grief, and lose all respect for thyself. This seems to me to be the moral imperative of nature, which is certainly neither categorical as old Kant wished, consequently the otherwise, nor does it address itself to the individual. What does nature care for the individual? But to nations, races, ages and ranks. Above all, however, to the animal man generally, to mankind. 189. Industrious races find it a great hardship to be idle. It was a masterstroke of English instinct to hallow and begloom Sunday to such an extent that the Englishman unconsciously hankers for his week and work-day again, as a kind of cleverly devised, cleverly intercalated fast, such as is also frequently found in the ancient world, although, as is appropriate in southern nations, not precisely with respect to work. Many kinds of fasts are necessary, and wherever powerful influences and habits prevail, legislators have to see that intercalary days are appointed, on which such impulses are fettered and learn to hunger anew. Viewed from a higher standpoint, whole generations and epochs, when they show themselves infected with any moral fanaticism, seem like those intercalated periods of restraint and fasting, during which an impulse learns to humble and submit itself, at the same time also to purify and sharpen itself. Certain philosophical sects likewise admit of a similar interpretation. For instance, the Stoa, in the midst of Hellenic culture, with the atmosphere rank and overcharged with aphrodisiacal odours. Here also is a hint for the explanation of the paradox, why it was precisely in the most Christian period of European history, and in general only under the pressure of Christian sentiments, that the sexual impulse sublimated into love, amor passion. 190. There is something in the morality of Plato which does not really belong to Plato, but which only appears in his philosophy, one might say, in spite of him, namely Socratism, for which he himself was too noble. No one desires to injure himself, hence all evil is done unwittingly. The evil man inflicts injury on himself. He would not do so, however, if he knew that evil is evil. The evil man, therefore, is only evil through error. If one free him from error, one will necessarily make him good. This mode of reasoning savours of the populace, who perceive only the unpleasant consequences of evil-doing, and practically judge that it is stupid to do wrong, while they accept good as identical with useful and pleasant, without further thought. As regards every system of utilitarianism, one may at once assume that it has the same origin and follow the scent. One will seldom err. Plato did all he could to interpret something refined and noble into the tenets of his teacher, and above all to interpret himself into them. He, the most daring of all interpreters, who lifted the entire Socrates out of the street as a popular theme and song to exhibit him in endless and impossible modifications, namely in all his own disguises and multiplicities. In jest, and in Homeric language as well, what is the Platonic Socrates, if not pros the Platon opithen te Platon messe te chimera? 191. The old theological problem of faith and knowledge, or, more plainly, of instinct and reason. The question whether, in respect to the valuation of things, instinct deserves more authority than rationality, which wants to appreciate and act according to motives, according to a why, that is to say, in conformity to purpose and utility. It is always the old moral problem that first appeared in the person of Socrates and had divided men's minds long before Christianity. Socrates himself, following, of course, the taste of his talent, that of a surpassing dialectician, took first the side of reason. And, in fact, what did he do all his life but laugh at the awkward incapacity of the noble Athenians, who were men of instinct, like all noble men, and could never give satisfactory answers concerning the motives of their actions. In the end, however, though silently and secretly, he laughed also at himself. With his finer conscience and introspection, he found in himself the same difficulty and incapacity. But why, he said to himself, should one on that account separate oneself from the instincts? One must set them right, and the reason also, one must follow the instincts, but at the same time persuade the reason to support them with good arguments. This was the real falseness of that great and mysterious ironist. He brought his conscience up to the point that he was satisfied with a kind of self-outwitting. In fact, he perceived the irrationality in the moral judgment. Plato, more innocent in such matters, and without the craftiness of the plebeian, wished to prove to himself, at the expenditure of all his strength, the greatest strength a philosopher had ever expended, that reason and instinct lead spontaneously to one goal, to the good, to God. And since Plato, all theologians and philosophers have followed the same path, which means that in matters of morality, instinct, or as Christians call it, faith, or as I call it, the herd, has hitherto triumphed. Unless one should make an exception in the case of Descartes, the father of rationalism, and consequently the grandfather of the Revolution, who recognized only the authority of reason. But reason is only a tool, and Descartes was superficial. 192. Whoever has followed the history of a single science finds in its development a clue to the understanding of the oldest and commonest processes of all knowledge and cognizance. There, as here, the premature hypotheses, the fictions, the good stupid will to belief, and the lack of distrust and patience are first developed. Our senses learn late, and never learn completely, to be subtle, reliable and cautious organs of knowledge. Our eyes find it easier on a given occasion to produce a picture already often produced than to seize upon the divergence and novelty of an impression. The latter requires more force, more morality. It is difficult and painful for the ear to listen to anything new. We hear strange music badly. When we hear another language spoken, we involuntarily attempt to form the sounds into words with which we are more familiar and conversant. It was thus, for example, that the Germans modified the spoken word Ocubalista into Armbrust, crossbow. Our senses are also hostile and averse to the new, and generally, even in the simplest processes of sensation, the emotions dominate, such as fear, love, hatred, and the passive emotion of indolence. As little as a reader nowadays reads all the single words, not to speak of syllables, of a page, he rather takes about 5 out of every 20 words at random and guesses the probably appropriate sense to them. Just as little do we see a tree correctly and completely in respect to its leaves, branches, colour and shape. We find it so much easier to fancy the chance of a tree. Even in the midst of the most remarkable experiences, we still do just the same. We fabricate the greater part of the experience, and can hardly be made to contemplate any event, except as inventors thereof. All this goes to prove that from our fundamental nature, and from remote ages, we have been accustomed to lying. Or, to express it more politely and hypocritically, in short, more pleasantly, one is much more of an artist than one is aware of. In an animated conversation, I often see the face of the person with whom I am speaking so clearly and sharply defined before me, according to the thought he expresses, or which I believe to be evoked in his mind, that the degree of distinctness far exceeds the strength of my visual faculty. The delicacy of the play of muscles and of the expression of the eyes must, therefore, be imagined by me. Probably the person put on quite a different expression, or none at all. 193. Quidquid luce fuit, tenebris agit, but also contrariwise. What we experience in dreams, provided we experience it often, pertains at last just as much to the general belongings of our soul as anything actually experienced. By virtue thereof we are richer or poorer, we have a requirement more or less, and finally, in broad daylight, and even in the brightest moments of our waking life, we are ruled to some extent by the nature of our dreams. Supposing that someone has often flown in his dreams, and that at last, as soon as he dreams, he is conscious of the power and art of flying as his privilege and his peculiarly enviable happiness. Such a person, who believes that on the slightest impulse he can actualize all sorts of curves and angles, who knows the sensation of a certain divine levity, an upwards without effort or constraint, a downwards without descending or lowering, without trouble. How could the man with such dream experiences and dream habits fail to find happiness differently coloured and defined, even in his waking hours? How could he fail to long differently for happiness? Flight, such as is described by poets, must, when compared with his own flying, be far too earthly, muscular, violent, far too troublesome for him. 194. The difference among men does not manifest itself only in the difference of their lists of desirable things, in their regarding different good things as worth striving for, and being disagreed as to the greater or less value, the order of rank, of the commonly recognized desirable things. It manifests itself much more in what they regard as actually having and possessing a desirable thing. As regards a woman, for instance, the control over her body and her sexual gratification serves as an amply sufficient sign of ownership and possession to the more modest man. Another, with a more suspicious and ambitious thirst for possession, sees the questionableness, the mere apparentness of such ownership, and wishes to have finer tests in order to know especially whether the woman not only gives herself to him, but also gives up for his sake what she has or would like to have. Only then does he look upon her as possessed. A third, however, has not even here got to the limit of his distrust and his desire for possession. He asks himself whether the woman, when she gives up everything for him, does not perhaps do so for a phantom of him. He wishes first to be thoroughly, indeed profoundly well known. In order to be loved at all, he ventures to let himself be found out. Only then does he feel the beloved one fully in his possession, when she no longer deceives herself about him, when she loves him just as much for the sake of his devilry and concealed insatiability, as for his goodness, patience, and spirituality. One man would like to possess a nation, and he finds all the higher arts of Cagliostro and Catalina suitable for his purpose. Another, with a more refined thirst for possession, says to himself, "One may not deceive where one desires to possess." He is irritated and impatient at the idea that a mask of him should rule in the hearts of the people. I must, therefore, make myself known, and first of all learn how to know myself. Among helpful and charitable people, one almost always finds the awkward craftiness which first gets up suitably him who has to be helped. As though, for instance, he should merit help, seek just their help, and would show himself deeply grateful, attached and subservient to them for all help. With these conceits they take control of the needy as a property, just as in general they are charitable and helpful out of a desire for property. One finds them jealous when they are crossed or forestalled in their charity. Parents involuntarily make something like themselves out of their children. They call that education. No mother doubts at the bottom of her heart that the child she has borne is thereby her property. No father hesitates about his right to his own ideas and notions of worth. Indeed, in former times, fathers deemed it right to use their discretion concerning the life or death of the newly born, as among the ancient Germans. And like the father, so also do the teacher, the class, the priest, and the prince still see in every new individual an unobjectionable opportunity for a new possession. The consequence is 195. The Jews, a people born for slavery, as Tacitus and the whole ancient world say of them, the chosen people among the nations, as they themselves say and believe. The Jews performed the miracle of the inversion of valuations, by means of which life on earth obtained a new and dangerous charm for a couple of millenniums. Their prophets fused into one the expressions rich, godless, wicked, violent, sensual, and for the first time coined the term world as a term of reproach. In this inversion of valuations, in which is also included the use of the word poor as synonymous with saint and friend, the significance of the Jewish people is to be found. It is with them that the slave insurrection in morals commences. 196. It is to be inferred that there are countless dark bodies near the sun, such as we shall never see. Among ourselves this is an allegory, and the psychologist of morals reads the whole star writing merely as an allegorical and symbolic language in which much may be unexpressed. 197. The beast of prey and the man of prey, for instance Caesar Borgia, are fundamentally misunderstood. Nature is misunderstood, so long as one seeks a morbidness in the constitution of these healthiest of all tropical monsters and growths, or even an innate hell in them, as almost all moralists have done hitherto. Does it not seem that there is a hatred of the virgin forest and of the tropics among moralists? And that the tropical man must be discredited at all costs, whether as disease and deterioration of mankind, or as his own hell and self-torture? And why? In favour of the temperate zones? In favour of the temperate men? The moral? The mediocre? This for the chapter, Morals as Timidity. 198. All the systems of morals which address themselves to individuals with a view to their happiness, as it is called, what else are they but suggestions for behaviour adapted to the degree of danger from themselves in which the individuals live? Recipes for their passions, their good and bad propensities, insofar as such have the will to power and would like to play the master. Small and great expediencies and elaborations, permeated with the musty odour of old family medicines and old wife wisdom, all of them grotesque and absurd in their form, because they address themselves to all, because they generalise where generalisation is not authorised, all of them speaking unconditionally and taking themselves unconditionally, all of them flavoured not merely with one grain of salt, but rather endurable only, and sometimes even seductive, when they are overspiced and begin to smell dangerously, especially of the other world. That is all of little value when estimated intellectually, and is far from being science, much less wisdom. But repeated once more, and 3 times repeated, it is expediency, 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 mixed with stupidity, 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 whether it be the indifference and statuesque coldness towards the heated folly of the emotions, which the Stoics advised and fostered, or the no more laughing and no more weeping of Spinoza, the destruction of the emotions by their analysis and vivisection, which he recommended so naively, or the lowering of the emotions to an innocent mean at which they may be satisfied, the Aristotelianism of morals, or even morality as the enjoyment of the emotions in a voluntary attenuation and spiritualization by the symbolism of art, perhaps as music or as love of God, and of mankind for God's sake. For in religion the passions are once more enfranchised, provided that, or even finally, even the complacent and wanton surrender to the emotions, as has been taught by Hafiz and Goethe, the bold letting go of the reins, the spiritual and corporeal licentia morum in the exceptional cases of wise old codgers and drunkards, with whom it no longer has much danger. This also for the chapter Morals as Timidity. 199. Inasmuch as in all ages, as long as mankind has existed, there have also been human herds, family alliances, communities, tribes, peoples, states, churches, and always a great number who obey in proportion to the small number who command. In view, therefore, of the fact that obedience has been most practised and fostered among mankind hitherto, one may reasonably suppose that, generally speaking, the need thereof is now innate in everyone, as a kind of formal conscience, which gives the command, "Thou shalt unconditionally do something, unconditionally refrain from something. In short, thou shalt." This need tries to satisfy itself and to fill its form with a content according to its strength, impatience, and eagerness. It at once seizes as an omnivorous appetite with little selection, and accepts whatever is shouted into its ear by all sorts of commanders, parents, teachers, laws, class prejudices, or public opinion. The extraordinary limitation of human development, the hesitation, protractedness, frequent retrogression and turning thereof, is attributable to the fact that the herd instinct of obedience is transmitted best, and at the cost, of the art of command. If one imagine this instinct increasing to its greatest extent, commanders and independent individuals will finally be lacking altogether, or they will suffer inwardly from a bad conscience, and will have to impose a deception on themselves in the first place, in order to be able to command just as if they also were only obeying. This condition of things actually exists in Europe at present. I call it the moral hypocrisy of the commanding class. They know no other way of protecting themselves from their bad conscience than by playing the role of executors of older and higher orders, of predecessors, of the Constitution, of justice, of the law, or of God himself. Or they even justify themselves by maxims from the current opinions of the herd, as first servants of their people, or instruments of the public weal. On the other hand, the gregarious European man nowadays assumes an air as if he were the only kind of man that is allowable. He glorifies his qualities, such as public spirit, kindness, deference, industry, temperance, modesty, indulgence, sympathy, by virtue of which he is gentle, endurable, and useful to the herd, as the peculiarly human virtues. In cases, however, where it is believed that the leader and bellwether cannot be dispensed with, attempt after attempt is made nowadays to replace commanders by the summing together of clever, gregarious men. All representative constitutions, for example, are of this origin. In spite of all, what a blessing, what a deliverance from a weight becoming unendurable, is the appearance of an absolute ruler for these gregarious Europeans. Of this fact, the effect of the appearance of Napoleon was the last great proof. The history of the influence of Napoleon is almost the history of the higher happiness to which the entire century has attained in its worthiest individuals and periods. 200. The man of an age of dissolution which mixes the races with one another, who has the inheritance of a diversified descent in his body, that is to say, contrary, and often not only contrary, instincts and standards of value, which struggle with one another and are seldom at peace, such a man of late culture and broken lights will, on an average, be a weak man. His fundamental desire is that the war which is in him should come to an end. Happiness appears to him in the character of a soothing medicine and mode of thought, for instance Epicurean or Christian, as above all things the happiness of repose, of undisturbedness, of repletion, of final unity, as the Sabbath of Sabbaths, to use the expression of the holy rhetorician St. Augustine, who was himself such a man. Should, however, the contrariety and conflict in such natures operate as an additional incentive and stimulus to life, and if, on the other hand, in addition to their powerful and irreconcilable instincts, they have also inherited and indoctrinated into them a proper mastery and subtlety for carrying on the conflict with themselves, that is to say, the faculty of self-control and self-deception. There then arise those marvellously incomprehensible and inexplicable beings, those enigmatical men predestined for conquering and circumventing others, the finest examples of which are Alcibiades and Caesar, with whom I should like to associate the first of Europeans, according to my taste, the Hohenstaufen, Friedrich II, and among artists, perhaps Leonardo da Vinci. They appear precisely in the same periods when that weaker type, with its longing for repose, comes to the front. The two types are complementary to each other and spring from the same causes. 201. As long as the utility which determines moral estimates is only gregarious utility, as long as the preservation of the community is only kept in view, and the immoral is sought precisely and exclusively in what seems dangerous to the maintenance of the community, there can be no morality of love to one's neighbour. Granted even that there is already a little constant exercise of consideration, sympathy, fairness, gentleness and mutual assistance. Granted that even in this condition of society, all those instincts are already active, which are latterly distinguished by honourable names as virtues, and eventually almost coincide with the conception morality. In that period, they do not, as yet, belong to the domain of moral valuations. They are still ultra-moral. A sympathetic action, for instance, is neither called good nor bad, moral nor immoral, in the best period of the Romans. And should it be praised, a sort of resentful disdain is compatible with this praise, even at the best. Directly the sympathetic action is compared with one which contributes to the welfare of the whole, to the res publica. After all, love to our neighbour is always a secondary matter, partly conventional and arbitrarily manifest in relation to our fear of our neighbour. After the fabric of society seems, on the whole, established and secured against external dangers, it is this fear of our neighbour which again creates new perspectives of moral valuation. Certain strong and dangerous instincts, such as the love of enterprise, foolhardiness, revengefulness, astuteness, rapacity and love of power, which up till then had not only to be honoured from the point of view of general utility, under other names of course than those here given, but had to be fostered and cultivated because they were perpetually required in the common danger against the common enemies, are now felt in their dangerousness to be doubly strong when the outlets for them are lacking, and are gradually branded as immoral and given over to calumny. The contrary instincts and inclinations now attain to moral honour. The gregarious instinct gradually draws its conclusions. How much or how little dangerousness to the community or to equality is contained in an opinion, a condition, an emotion, a disposition, or an endowment, that is now the moral perspective. Here again, fear is the mother of morals. It is by the loftiest and strongest instincts, when they break out passionately and carry the individual far above and beyond the average and the low level of the gregarious conscience, that the self-reliance of the community is destroyed. Its belief in itself, its backbone, as it were, breaks. Consequently, these very instincts will be most branded and defamed. The lofty, independent spirituality, the will to stand alone, and even the cogent reason, are felt to be dangers. Everything that elevates the individual above the herd, and is a source of fear to the neighbour, is henceforth called evil. The tolerant, unassuming, self-adapting, self-equalizing disposition, the mediocrity of desires, attains to moral distinction and honour. Finally, under very peaceful circumstances, there is always less opportunity and necessity for training the feelings to severity and rigour, and now every form of severity, even injustice, begins to disturb the conscience. A lofty and rigorous nobleness and self-responsibility almost offends and awakens distrust. The lamb, and still more the sheep, wins respect. There is a point of diseased mellowness and effeminacy in the history of society, at which society itself takes the part of him who injures it, the part of the criminal, and does so, in fact, seriously and honestly. To punish appears to it to be somehow unfair. It is certain that the idea of punishment and the obligation to punish are then painful and alarming to people. Is it not sufficient if the criminal be rendered harmless? Why should we still punish? Punishment itself is terrible. With these questions, gregarious morality, the morality of fear, draws its ultimate conclusion. If one could at all do away with danger, the cause of fear, one would have done away with this morality at the same time. It would no longer be necessary. It would not consider itself any longer necessary. Whoever examines the conscience of the present-day European will always elicit the same imperative from its thousand moral folds and hidden recesses, the imperative of the timidity of the herd. We wish that some time or other there may be nothing more to fear. some time or other, the will and the way thereto is nowadays called progress all over Europe. 202. Let us at once say again what we have already said 100 times, for people's ears nowadays are unwilling to hear such truths, our truths. We know well enough how offensive it sounds when anyone plainly and without metaphor counts man among the animals, but it will be accounted to us almost a crime that it is precisely in respect to men of modern ideas that we have consistently applied the terms herd instincts, and such like expressions. What avail is it? We cannot do otherwise, for it is precisely here that our new insight is. We have found that in all the principal moral judgments, Europe has become unanimous, including likewise the countries where European influence prevails. In Europe, people evidently know what Socrates thought he did not know, and what the famous serpent of old once promised to teach. They know today what is good and evil. It must then sound hard and be distasteful to the ear, when we always insist that that which here thinks it knows, that which here glorifies itself with praise and blame, and calls itself good, is the instinct of the herding human animal, the instinct which has come and is ever coming more and more to the front. To preponderance and supremacy over other instincts, according to the increasing physiological approximation and resemblance of which it is the symptom. Morality in Europe at present is herding animal morality, and therefore, as we understand the matter, only one kind of human morality, beside which, before which, and after which, many other moralities, and above all higher moralities, are or should be possible. Against such a possibility, against such a should be, however, this morality defends itself with all its strength. It says obstinately and inexorably, I am morality itself, and nothing else is morality. Indeed, with the help of a religion which has humoured and flattered the sublimest desires of the herding animal, things have reached such a point that we always find a more visible expression of this morality, even in political and social arrangements. The democratic movement is the inheritance of the Christian movement. That its tempo, however, is much too slow and sleepy for the more impatient ones, for those who are sick and distracted by the herding instinct, is indicated by the increasingly furious howling and always less disguised teeth-gnashing of the anarchist dogs, who are now roving through the highways of European culture, apparently in opposition to the peacefully industrious democrats and revolution ideologues, and still more so to the awkward philosophers and fraternity visionaries who call themselves socialists and want a free society, but in reality at one with them all in their thorough and instinctive hostility to every form of society other than that of the autonomous herd, to the extent even of repudiating the notions master and servant. Ni Dieu ni maître, says a socialist formula. At one in their tenacious opposition to every special claim, every special right and privilege. This means ultimately opposition to every right, for when all are equal, no one needs rights any longer. At one in their distrust of punitive justice, as though it were a violation of the weak, a wrong to the necessary consequences of all former society. But equally at one in their religion of sympathy, in their compassion for all that feels, lives and suffers, down to the very animals, up to even God. The extravagance of sympathy for God belongs to a democratic age. Altogether at one in the cry and impatience of their sympathy, in their deadly hatred of suffering generally, in their almost feminine incapacity for witnessing it or allowing it, at one in their involuntary beglooming and besoftening, under the spell of which Europe seems to be threatened with a new Buddhism. At one in their belief in the morality of mutual sympathy, as though it were morality in itself, the climax, the attained climax of mankind, the sole hope of the future, the consolation of the present, the great discharge from all the obligations of the past. Altogether at one in their belief in the community as the deliverer, in the herd, and therefore in themselves. 203. We who hold a different belief, we who regard the democratic movement not only as a degenerating form of political organisation, but as equivalent to a degenerating, a waning type of man, as involving his mediocrising and depreciation, where have we to fix our hopes? In new philosophers, there is no other alternative, in minds strong and original enough to initiate opposite estimates of value, to transvalue and invert eternal valuations. In forerunners, in men of the future, who in the present shall fix the constraints and fasten the knots which will compel millenniums to take new paths. To teach man the future of humanity as his will, as depending on human will, and to make preparation for vast hazardous enterprises and collective attempts in rearing and educating, in order thereby to put an end to the frightful rule of folly and chance, which has hitherto gone by the name of history. The folly of the greatest number is only its last form. For that purpose a new type of philosopher and commander will some time or another be needed, at the very idea of which everything that has existed in the way of occult, terrible and benevolent beings might look pale and dwarfed. The image of such leaders hovers before our eyes. Is it lawful for me to say it aloud, ye free spirits? The conditions which one would partly have to create and partly utilise for their genesis, the presumptive methods and tests by virtue of which a soul should grow up to such an elevation and power as to feel a constraint to these tasks, a transvaluation of values, under the new pressure and hammer of which a conscience should be steeled and a heart transformed into brass, so as to bear the weight of such responsibility, and, on the other hand, the necessity for such leaders, the dreadful danger that they might be lacking, or miscarry and degenerate. These are our real anxieties and glooms. Ye know it well, ye free spirits. These are the heavy, distant thoughts and storms which sweep across the heaven of our life. There are few pains so grievous as to have seen, divined, or experienced how an exceptional man has missed his way and deteriorated. But he who has the rare eye for the universal danger of man himself deteriorating, he who like us has recognised the extraordinary fortuitousness which has hitherto played its game in respect to the future of mankind, a game in which neither the hand nor even a finger of God has participated. He who divines the fate that is hidden under the idiotic unwariness and blind confidence of modern ideas, and still more under the whole of Christo-European morality, suffers from an anguish with which no other is to be compared. He sees at a glance all that could still be made out of man through a favourable accumulation and augmentation of human powers and arrangements. He knows with all the knowledge of his conviction how unexhausted man still is for the greatest possibilities, and how often in the past the type man has stood in presence of mysterious decisions and new paths. He knows still better from his painfulest recollections on what wretched obstacles promising developments of the highest rank have hitherto usually gone to pieces, broken down, sunk and become contemptible. The universal degeneracy of mankind to the level of the man of the future, as idealized by the socialistic fools and shallowpates, This degeneracy and dwarfing of man to an absolutely gregarious animal, or as they call it, to a man of free society. This brutalizing of man into a pygmy with equal rights and claims is undoubtedly possible. He who has thought out this possibility to its ultimate conclusion knows another loathing unknown to the rest of mankind, and perhaps also a new mission. End of chapter 5.